Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Crysis 3 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a first-person shooter, the sequel to Crysis 2, and as of right now, the final game in the Crysis series. Remains to be seen whether we're going to see other games in it, but for now, this is the last one. And it was pretty well received when it came out in February 2013. It was pretty well received for its visuals in particular, of course, that stands to reason considering it's Crytek and the CryEngine. But they also praised a lot of other elements, and it actually won a couple of awards. So that begs the question, how did this thing actually turn out? Is it as good as it's claimed to be? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's really not that huge of a step up from Crysis 2, actually. The main difference here is that there's a lot more of the open environments, and they're very, very well detailed for the most part. Although you do have some issues here and there. For example, the texture quality is not exactly the best around. It's good for the most part, but there are some instances where you'll look at certain things and the texture quality is actually very low res, even though you got the thing maxed out. And what you're seeing here is the game on the max settings. I did disable motion blur, but that was basically it. And I tweaked a few things like the FOV, because the FOV for the game is horrible. But that's to be expected. It's a multi-platform game, and, well, they had to make compromises for the consoles, right? But at least the game actually looks pretty good. It is definitely still a visual powerhouse, and it definitely does a good job of showing off what CryEngine 3 is capable of, at least as of the version that this was released with. Obviously, in the time since then, we've had some advancements to the CryEngine, and when you put it on the PC exclusive scene, you're seeing a lot more advanced effects that just look a lot better than this. But at the time, this was definitely a visual powerhouse, and it still looks very good to this day. It certainly helps that there's a lot of lush greenery here. Instead of just being nothing but brown and gray and realistic, they actually put some effort into making there actually be colors other than just brown and gray. And that is infinitely appreciated. But then we come to the sound design, and this is where things get a bit iffy in spots. As far as the sound effects themselves go, they've done a very good job with a lot of them. A lot of them are just recycled from Crysis 2, actually, with some slight differences in tone, or they'll put a slightly different effect on it, but it's still the same sound, and you can very easily tell that. And these sounds certainly fit in very well with the environments, and they've done a very good job with most of them. Most of the weapons don't sound horribly underpowered or anything, so that's certainly appreciated. But then you come to the music and the voice acting. I'll start with the music, which is a combination of orchestral music with electronic. And while it does work okay for the game, you get this kind of odd sense of genericness. Like it was trying a bit too hard and falls flat. It's not bad music by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's pretty solid music. But it just seems like they were trying way too hard to make this theme feel epic. And it just ends up falling on its face as a result. And then there's the voice acting, where characters can range from completely over the top and ridiculous to actually in danger of making you see some emotion from the characters in a heartbeat. It's really inconsistent, and while the voice acting itself is not bad per se, there's just things about it that baffle me. For example, the guy who voices Prophet sounds like he came from the Adam West school of acting. He sounds pretty ridiculous all the time, and it's just this kind of weird, stilted voice acting that just doesn't fit in very well. And you're having to put up with that the entire game because you're playing as Prophet. And then there's Psycho, who cusses entirely too much, and it feels like he's just made to be as British as possible. I don't get it, really. But other characters just kind of sound ridiculous sometimes, and at other times they sound alright. And it really does fall down to the writing that really proves the problem there, and at least the writing and the direction. Because the voice actors are definitely capable of pulling off some decent performances, but they don't always. And when you look at more into the other parts of the game, you start to see why. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this, well, before I really get into that, Let me first mention, yes, Crytek has never been good at writing stories and characters in their games, and that's never the main draw of their games. But in this particular case, it actually ends up being a very significant detriment, because one problem that Crysis always had that the original Far Cry didn't is that it takes itself way too damn seriously. Far Cry had this kind of tongue-in-cheek feel, like they were very aware of how stupid their story was, and they just kind of rolled with it. When you got to Crysis, they seemed like they were trying to play it very seriously, and they continued that on up through Crysis 3. Crysis 3 is the attempt to be the most serious out of all of these things, where now you're playing as Prophet once again, the guy you played in the original Crysis, who is basically no longer human. He has completely interfaced with his suit and merged with it, and is really more machine now than anything else. But he's still him, somewhere in there. And they tried to throw in this subplot of him trying to reclaim or maintain his humanity when he's basically no longer human. The problem is, they do it in this really ham-fisted way that just comes across as stupid rather than anything else. It's supposed to be emotional and impactful, and it fails miserably at it. Moreover, it fails miserably at Psycho's subplot too, which is basically that he's been stripped away from his nanosuit and is basically trying to come to terms with just being a human. And they fail miserably on both of these fronts. So, when you actually get into the main plot, you start to wonder, well, how could this get any worse than those? You'd be amazed. This is set about 24 years after the events of Crysis 2, and in the time since that, the Cell Corporation has taken over the entire world by being its sole energy producer. And they've basically instituted a totalitarian regime. And this is a totalitarian regime that is run by debt enslavement. Basically, everybody builds up a debt to the Cell Corporation, and they force them to work as slaves. It's an incredibly stupid setup, and it makes no sense right from the start. On top of that, you have this second plot that goes beyond the setup of Cell Corp is ruling the world because evil corporation, and that involves the Alpha Ceph, the big bad alien that controls all the other aliens that have invaded the Earth, and Prophet is convinced that the Alpha Ceph is coming and that they have to fight the Alpha Ceph, and you can already see where the problems are. The setup is completely ridiculous. It is complete nonsense, and yet they play it incredibly seriously. If they had just taken this thing and said, you know what, yes, our game is completely ridiculous, and they just rolled with it, it probably would have been fine. But instead, they play it so serious that it outright becomes infuriating. You're constantly having to put up with tired cliches, and even worse, a lot of modern FPS tropes that just get thrown in there because it's a modern FPS and we might as well. Things like having to wait for the plot to progress because you're waiting for an NPC to open a door, because apparently you can't be trusted to open a frickin' door. Except that you can, because you have to do it yourself several times. You see, it's problems like this that just drive the player crazy. And when your plot is so over the top and nonsensical that you couldn't possibly give a crap about it, and yet they keep acting like you should, it feels incredibly condescending. But I would be willing to overlook the plot if the gameplay was up to snuff. It is a first-person shooter after all. They don't tend to focus very much on the story and focus instead on the gameplay. And of course, Crysis has always had an interesting setup for its gameplay that I felt wasn't really exploited to its fullest effect in both the original game and Crysis 2. So there's certainly room for improvement here, right? Well, let's first talk about what that idea is. You are in this nanosuit, and you do have these various special abilities. You have a cloaking mechanism, where you can basically turn on optical camouflage, and you're effectively invisible. Except you're not fully invisible, but close enough. There's an armor power that increases your armor and basically makes you take a huge amount of damage compared to when you don't have it on. There's the ability to do a super jump, where you can jump really, really high, and you can also do an air stomp if you do that, where you just slam into the ground and do massive damage. You can sprint really fast. You can also use your visor to zoom in on things and turn on nano vision, which is basically a heat vision mode. And so, it all contributes to this idea of being a super soldier. Now, one thing they added into Crysis 3 in terms of the suit powers is the ability to hack into things with the visor. Now, you can do this when you're standing next to the thing anyway, but when you go in to hack things via the visor, you are treated to, well, this. Quite literally, all you have to do is time your button presses right, and that's the entire hacking minigame. And you have to do this quite a lot if you decide to do that to turrets and such, which allows you to basically have the turrets attack the enemy rather than you. So that does help some things out, and it does render some variety to the game, but when you have this new mechanic that is basically just tacked on, and everything else is stuff we've already seen, well, it doesn't really inspire all that much confidence. And you hope that with the suit upgrades you can advance these powers to do some cool new things, except you really can't. The upgrades to your suit provide passive bonuses, and you can only have 4 things activated at any given point. And I found that really the things you can get at the very beginning are the most useful. It's actually kind of sad. They didn't really think this through all the way, it seems, and most of the suit upgrades are just fairly underwhelming. So once again, the suit is really not utilized to its fullest potential, and you don't really get the feeling that the suit is anything more than just a gimmick to make the game seem a bit different from other games. And really that's a shame, because there's so much potential with the nanosuit that they just never do anything with. It's actually pretty irritating now that it's 3 games in, and they still haven't utilized the nanosuit to its fullest potential. It's just depressing, really. But what about the rest of the game apart from the suit? Well, this is basically just Crysis 2 repackaged, with some slight tweaks here and there. Namely, there's more of an emphasis on stealth in this one than there was in Crysis 2, where there was a lot of instances where you just basically had to run and gun. Now, in Crysis 3, they seem to have the idea that stealth was the way to go. So what they do is very, very early in the game, in fact in the first level, you get a bow, which has various types of arrows. And now you're thinking, oh cool, I get to be Rambo! And to some degree, yes you do, only you get a nanosuit. And the bow is special, because unlike every other weapon in the entire game, you remain cloaked when you use your bow. And frankly, that is the biggest problem this game has. The stealth is completely broken. Not only do you stay cloaked when you use the bow, it's a one-hit kill, and you can reuse the arrows. Except for the special arrows, you had to go find refills on those. But the standard arrows, you can just pluck them out of enemy corpses and just keep going. So now you have a one-hit kill weapon that works while you're cloaked and keeps you cloaked, and has effectively infinite ammo. So, do you see the problem here? The game becomes painfully easy, to the point where it just becomes boring. Now, a lot of you are probably going, oh, you should play it on a higher difficulty. I did. it's still painfully easy. Really, all the higher difficulties do is make you feel more like tissue paper than anything else. They don't really improve the AI very much, and you find very quickly that the AI is pretty much dumber than a sack of hammers. So, you're never really gonna have any problems here. There are some enemies that you really can't deal with the bow, but they're fairly few and far between, and frankly, all you need is the bow and the Scar, which is just the standard assault rifle in the game. Why? Because the Scar has an extended magazine attachment, which gives you 80 round drums, and you can just spray and pray with that thing if you need to. So you now have effectively a machine gun that you can stick a suppressor on, I might add. And you have a one-hit kill, really long-range weapon. It does have a bit of a delay on when the projectile actually hits, but it's not really that much. And you don't really get much of an arc to it. In fact, there really isn't an arc. It shoots pretty much like a laser. And so you find that no matter what situation you get thrown into, you're effectively an unstoppable badass. Now, that would be cool, except that instead of really feeling like an unstoppable badass, you just feel like the game is slowing you down. You feel like it's just throwing stuff in your way so that you can just spend the next 20 or 30 minutes slowly moving through the brush with your cloak on, and then when your energy runs out, you have to hide behind something, let your energy recharge, which doesn't take very long, but it does add up over time. And then you just keep moving along, slaughtering the enemies left, right, and center because they're insanely easy to take down, and the stealth is broken. And there's really no reason to play this thing in a run-and-gun style unless you're just deliberately wanting to play like Crysis 2. Because that's what that's like. It's like playing Crysis 2, only not as good. And frankly, that's kind of sad to say, because Crysis 2 was not a good game. It was extremely underwhelming. And that's exactly how it plays out here if you decide to completely go against the stealth idea and just run in guns blazing. There's not really any logical reason to do that. The only logical way to play it is to be the unstoppable stealthy badass. And that's just boring. And I would rather a game just be bad than be boring. Because at least if it's bad, I can rant about it, or I can, make fun of it or something like that. Here, you really can't, because it is bad, but at the same time, it's also boring. And frankly, you can't do anything with boring. It's just boring. And in this particular case, it becomes so boring, it's depressing. I mean, I can't even make fun of this thing while I'm playing it. It's that boring. It boggles my mind. So now you might be wondering, well, DW, what about the multiplayer? Does that redeem it at all? Because the multiplayer in the previous games was at least fairly interesting, at least the idea. Well, no, it doesn't. Because unlike the single player, which is just bad and boring at the same time, the multiplayer is just straight up bad. Now, there's a variety of reasons for this. The map design is actually not one of them, although it's not particularly great either. I've seen better maps, I've seen worse maps, let's put it that way. But that's just kind of an aside thing. Now, what really breaks the multiplayer are the technical problems and the unlock system. You see, Crysis 2 had an unlock system as well, and it reserved some of the better gear for later on in the progression. In Crysis 3, on the other hand, all of the better gear is reserved for the later progression. So you basically don't stand a chance against anyone who's played the game longer than you. And so when you actually get into the game, you find that it's incredibly easy to get annihilated. So you start looking at reasons for why this might be, not just because the weapons are better. I mean, you can work around that to some degree. But you might be noticing something in the footage here. The hit detection is pretty awful. You don't really get a lot of consistency with it. Sometimes you might be aiming at their legs and hit them in the head. Other times, you might be aiming center mass and not hit them at all. It's just a complete crapshoot, and it doesn't seem to matter what your ping is. My ping wasn't really that high when I was playing. It was barely over 100 at all. And once I get into the 200 range is when I start to see where I had to actually compensate for the lag a bit more. Well, around 100 to 150, that's perfectly manageable. And yet, the hit detection is extremely inconsistent. And it's not even like this is a peer-to-peer game. This is on dedicated servers. So I don't know what exactly the problem is, but it seems like the netcode is just extremely spotty and they just never fixed it. Or maybe they attempted to fix it and they just broke it even further and said, you know what, screw it, barely anybody's playing this thing, who's gonna care? Well, it makes the multiplayer pretty infuriating. And even worse, the damage modeling seems extremely inconsistent. Where, when I have maximum armor on, it doesn't seem to matter that I have it on. I die in pretty much the exact same time than it took me to die beforehand when I didn't have the armor on. It's actually kind of baffling, because you might turn your armor on and be like, oh, well, I can survive this grenade blast because I could in the single player. Nope, you can't. At least, not without unlocks. Yeah. You see the problem here. The multiplayer is just straight up unfair, and it has technical problems that prevent it from actually being enjoyable. So, what are you left with in Crysis 3? Well, you're left with an extremely mediocre FPS to begin with, because it's based on Crysis 2. Well, they decided to take that and make pretty much every single thing in it worse. The only thing it does better than Crysis 2 is the visuals to a slight degree, so it's not really something better per se, it's just kind of a slight sidestep. But the level design, which is to say that there's more openness to the levels. That's not necessarily a bad or a good thing, though. It's just a thing. And while it's nice that they don't always treat you like a complete idiot like most modern FPSs do, it's just not enough. You can't redeem the game with some slightly open level design when it's so fundamentally broken in so many ways. And frankly, the fact that this thing got as high praise as it did for anything other than visuals and sound design is downright insulting. Is it the worst game I've ever played or anything like that? No! I've played far, far worse games than this. But it's easily the worst game in the Crysis series, and the Crysis series was never all that great to begin with. This has always been a series that has been way more tech demo than actually relevant game. But in this particular instance, it goes beyond just being a bit excusable because it's a tech demo. It goes into just being awful game territory. At least the original Crysis had some redeeming features, and you could make fun of it. And Crysis 2 wasn't horrible. It was just extremely mediocre. But this is the first outright bad game that Crytek has released. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.